13 Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 10. The House of Melkarth. As an Irish fellow working in Toronto, I had been looking for a house to live in, for I was sick of living in them apartments. Finally, when I'd almost given up hope, a friend of mine, Bob O'Connor, who I had met through the Catholic Church, told me he had a little house to rent on behalf of a man who lived in another town. He showed me the house. It was a grand little one, and so I rented it from him right away, even though I had odd misgivings. It was a little one-storey house on a side street, built on its own lot, with gardens front and back. Steps led up to the front door, where you entered upon a living room with a fireplace in it. Then, off a little hall, there were 2 bedrooms to one side of the house, and at the back there was a dining room and a kitchen. Then from the kitchen you went down steps to the boiler and laundry room on the other side of the house, and there was a side door leading out into a covered garage and driveway. The kitchen door led out into the back garden. There were a number of fruit trees and flower beds, and at the side of the house, occupying one side of the back garden, was a large wooden shed with a vaulted roof. I couldn't imagine what this was for, but it had a raised wooden floor. It was large enough to store a truck or house a large quantity of supplies. It was great that the house had a fireplace, and once you got a supply of logs, you could enjoy fires all through the winter. It felt just like back in Dublin. I determined that I'd use the shed at the back for storing the logs. After I moved into it, though, the house started to seem odd. For one thing, I had strange dreams there. One night I dreamt I was living in an evil city, Carthage, and there was an evil god presiding over it, whose name was Melkarth. You only saw the city at night, blackest night. I can remember looking down on it from a height, seeing the buildings surrounded by defensive walls that were impregnable. The city was evil, and so was everyone within it, and it was ruled by this Melkarth that was evil, evil to the core. I woke up from that dream with an overpowering sense of evil, and I remembered later that the night I had the dream of Melkarth, I hadn't actually gone to bed. I slept on the sofa because the hearth was so warm. I wondered what this dream meant. I didn't know much about Carthage. We learned about it at school, of course. It was always from a Roman point of view. Punica fides and all that. Hamilcar was up to no good. Hannibal was up to no good. Delenda est Carthago, Cato had said. When I free associated with it, I thought of the civilizations the Spaniards had found in the New World, like the Aztecs in Mexico. They were big on human sacrifice. A man had to be sacrificed every day so the sun would keep going. Children had to be sacrificed to Tlaloc so that there would be rain for their crops. The Aztecs even sacrificed a bunch of Spaniards they had captured. I thought of Carthage as an old world Mexico city. Perhaps the old world Phoenicians had sailed in their ships all the way to the Caribbean and then on to Mexico and founded a new civilization there. I had read a suggestion to that effect somewhere. Of course, I mainly thought of Carthage as an anti-Rome, standing against everything that Rome stood for. Melkarth, when I thought about him, was associated in my mind with Moloch. Children were passed through the fire to Moloch in Gehenna the valley outside Jerusalem that gave one of its names to hell. But Moloch, or Melkarth, was a Phoenician deity. He reigned over Tyre, and then he reigned over Carthage, which was a colony at Tyre. And there the ancients said the Phoenicians had sacrificed children to him as they had in Palestine. It was February, and a few weeks after I'd moved into the house. There was a knock at the door one foggy night. I opened it, and there was a strange young man I'd never seen before. A young man in his 20s, with dark hair and a moustache. The young man told me he was the previous tenant, and he'd come back to look for something in the back garden he'd left there. Go ahead, says I. The young man also said something about the fruit trees in the back garden, that they needed to be pruned in September. There was a youngish woman there too, who said she was his sister. Then they were gone, disappeared into the fog. Later on, the fellow who owned the house came back to live in town. When Bob O'Connor told me this, I was immediately alarmed, because I thought he would want his house back. But, as it happened, he went and lived in a rented house himself. I thought this was nice of him, since otherwise he would have been entitled to reclaim the house for his own use. It never occurred to me that he didn't want to live in the house himself. But he used to come around, and I didn't like the look of him. He was a man that always brought what seemed like a cloud of misery or bad feelings with him. He never smiled, and he had hard, small, dark eyes. He had a completely bald head, and he was clean-shaven. He always wore workmen's clothes, and he drove around in a van. He looked every bit like a handyman. He was a Protestant clergyman of some sort, but he had to do manual work to make a living. His wife worked in an office, I suppose to make money for them. He was an American that had come to Canada for some reason. His name was David Benton. It seemed to me that he was not what he seemed to be. It struck me that he might be a bogus clergyman of some sort. On the other hand, when you thought of bogus clergymen and crooked evangelists, you thought of fellas who managed to enrich themselves at their congregation's expense, demanding huge salaries and princely gifts every so often. Now that obviously wasn't the case here. This fellow looked like he was just managing to stay afloat, let alone being rich. The following winter it was very cold, and I had ordered a cord of firewood from fellas outside town, for there was a fireplace in the house where you could make good fires. The trouble was, the wood was a bit damp, and it was hard to get it to light. I had it stored in a pile in the big shed at the back, and it was taking its time about drying. I found out later, when I was more experienced, that you couldn't get firewood that was at all dry or usable except in the summer or early autumn. But I loved to have a good fire, to sit in front of it, after all that time spent in soulless apartments. I got a crazy idea. I had a bit of petrol in a can out in the old shed for the lawnmower, and I sprinkled it on the fire to get it going. Once or twice it worked all right. But the third time it didn't catch at first at all, and then I must have put on too much, for the whole thing started to blaze up and there was a chimney fire. As I watched this, horrified, I thought I heard a voice roaring from the fireplace at me. It sounded like an exultant "Ah!" like as if it was the devil himself. The smoke billowed out and made the whole room dark. Some neighbours even called the fire brigade, and they came, but by that time it was all over. I had to tell the landlord at the house about what had happened, because repairs and painting needed to be done. The landlord now wanted to get rid of me as a tenant. He said the insurance company demanded it, but I didn't want to go. I enlisted my old friend Bob O'Connor to mediate, and eventually the landlord left things as they were, or so it seemed. I should have got away from there, for I had a feeling that the place was evil or haunted. But I was possessed by the idea that I should stay there, that I had a right to, that this was my only home, and what have you. I didn't realise it, but the place had turned me head. I was in its spell. I had lost any sense of proportion. I was doing the opposite of what I should have done, if I had any wits about me at all. In the meantime, I got a call from the OPP, from a couple of detectives. I was startled by this. Had it something to do with the dispute over the house? But no, it was something else. It was about the previous tenant. His name was Steve McVeigh. I remembered the young man who had come to the door on a foggy night. Anyway, 2 detectives came over and asked me things about this young man, and had I found anything suspicious in the house, for they were investigating him for a murder. They even went and searched the shed outside, where the firewood was piled up, and the space under the house. They didn't say what they'd found. They just thanked me and left. Now, I was a fella that wasn't one to read the papers, but you may be sure I did after that. And sure enough, I read reports of a young man charged with the murder of a young woman who had disappeared and never been found. Her name was Marguerite Thompson, and she was from the West Indies. She had gone jogging on a road across a mountain some miles from there, and it seems he had driven by in his old truck and stopped and murdered her. They never found the body. They were looking for that, I suppose. But it seems when they searched the shed at the back, where Steve McVeigh had kept his truck, they did find what turned out to be some incriminating evidence. A pom-pom from a toque the victim was wearing, and a hair which turned out to be a match to hers. This was presented at the trial, and it was enough to secure his conviction. That was how they got him. He had been charged with 2 rapes before that. Anyway, he was convicted of murder now, and went down for 25 years without parole. But he denied guilt and wouldn't tell them what he'd done with the body. It only occurred to me after the detectives had been and gone that I should have told them, "You're not going to find a body." You know why? Because he burned it to ashes. I could picture him pouring petrol from a jerry can over the body somewhere and then setting it alight. And as it caught fire, I fancied I could hear the roar of exultation I had heard from the chimney not long before. For all I knew now, the ashes of the victim might be somewhere here. Maybe buried in the back garden, or disposed of under the shed, or under the house. I, living in the house, was reeling after this. So this was why the house felt so strange. It was haunted, all right, or there was an evil presence in it. It had something to do with a young man who had been a murderer. But it also had to do, I believed, with the landlord, who seemed to me now very much like a bogus clergyman. Whatever was evil in the house, this fella knew something about it. I had some talks with Bob O'Connor about this clergyman, who had once been a neighbour of his, and whom he seemed to know well. He told me that the clergyman had left town just before I rented the place, and he had gone to be pastor at another church in another town, a small town in the north. Oddly enough, after a couple of months he was back. And, as I say, he didn't want to live in his old house, but he was always coming round just the same. In the meantime, it seems he had gone back to being pastor at his old church. It seemed they hadn't had time to find a replacement for him, so they took him back. I wonder now whether they were even paying him. As I said, he seemed to be working as some sort of a handyman or small contractor. I had another friend named Jack Chrysler, whom I knew from the Catholic Church. He was a high school teacher, and he was divorced and lived alone. I discovered that he was a man of great spiritual gifts and great faith. He didn't know Bob O'Connor, but I told him all about the house. He was over there several times. At first he seemed to pick up on the idea that the house was possessed. He told me strongly that I should dig in and hold on to the house. I remember the words he used. Otherwise, someone else will say, "This will be my house. I'll live here." But then afterwards he seemed to change his mind and told me things would end with me having to give up the house. Things were quiet for a while, and then the landlord got the idea into his head that he wanted to sell the house. But I, renting it, dug in me heels now and wouldn't cooperate. As a result, the house wasn't sold. Then the landlord decided he wanted to renovate the place and told me I had to go. Of course I wouldn't go. But then I went back to Dublin for a 2-week holiday during the summer, and when I came home to Toronto, the place was burnt to the ground. Even the shed had burnt. The insurance men were never able to discover what caused the fire. Maybe faulty electrical wiring or something, they couldn't be sure. Anyway, the house was a smoking ruin. I lost all my property, and I had no insurance. Benton, I assumed, would be able to collect on his house insurance. Here's another thing though. Just before I finally had to leave, the tension was so great that I started to drink for relief. Oddly enough, it was spirits, or what the North Americans call hard liquor, cheap brandy and vodka, which I mixed with soda water and ginger ale and the like. I don't know what possessed me. I never drank spirits before or since. After a few months, I got off it. But then I developed a taste for wines and fortified wines, which lasted for years after that. You see, in the years afterwards, things got better for me. There couldn't have been much worse. But I kept on with the drink. This lasted 10 years, in fact. Finally, I was able to give the drink up, but not before it had started to cause health problems for me. So it was all there in that house. A sense of evil, but no urge to get away from it. A case of murder. A man who presided over the whole thing like a spider over a web. An addiction, which is like an evil spell. There were several people involved with the place, and they didn't seem to realise just how destructive it was. Good people, but just blind to the realities of the situation. They kept hovering around like moths around a candle flame. I was one of them. 10 years later, I met Bob O'Connor again. He phoned me because David Benton was dead. He had died of cancer. Before he died, he had got in touch with Bob O'Connor because he wanted to talk to him. Bob regarded this as the wish of a dying man because he knew how sick he was. So he went to see Benton. Now he wanted to tell me about it. David Benton was very gaunt at this stage, sitting up in bed, and you knew he didn't have long. So he talked and I listened. He wanted to confess about the house and everything else. He told me about his earlier life, things I didn't know about. He was born down in the States, and his father was a clergyman in some Presbyterian denomination. He followed in his father's footsteps, and eventually he ended up here. I'm not sure why. Anyway, he was given the pastorship of a church of the same Presbyterian denomination here. Now, they were straightforward evangelical Christians, but at some point they amalgamated with another independent church that happened to be on the same street. You know it. And this church was Spiritist. In other words, They called themselves Christians, but they believed in conjuring up spirits, the spirits of the dead. So these boyos amalgamated with Benton's Presbyterians, and soon the whole congregation, or at least a large part of it, was fascinated with communicating with relatives on the other side, as they called it. Benton got into it himself. He said because he wanted to communicate with his father, the clergyman, who had recently died. It seems father and son never really got along, and David Benton wanted to get his father's advice now for being a clergyman. They started holding séances at Benton's house, the one you lived in. The séances were very popular, and they were going on every Friday night. A fairly large slice of the congregation was coming to them. Benton himself encouraged them. He believed in it himself, of course, and his wife Maxine took an active part. She seemed to be gifted as a medium. But then things started to go horribly wrong. Besides the usual aunts and uncles reporting from the hereafter, they started to hear from a spirit who called himself Melkarth. I gasped. He looked at me puzzled. Does that mean anything to you? Of course it does. I heard the name in a dream when I moved in there. I'm sure I must have told you about it at one point. Well, maybe you did, but I don't remember that, he said. Anyway, this name didn't mean anything to them. It just sounded vaguely biblical. He came up in the séances more and more, and soon he was monopolizing them. He told them that the Bentons' house where they were meeting was to be called the House of Melkarth. So they agreed to that, and Benton even put up a brass plate on the door to that effect. I never saw that, I said. No, I dare say he took it down when they moved out. Anyway, the purpose of the séances was now to hear Melkarth's commandments for the congregation. They were pretty bad. For example, he told the men to share their wives, have them in common. For a lot of them, that offended their Presbyterian sense of morality, but some of them liked the idea and wanted to put it into practice. And these men being evangelical Protestants, they were the heads of their families, and the wives had to do what they said. Melkarth also told them they had to make sacrifices, blood sacrifices. They were to sacrifice their pets to God, so quite a number of dogs and cats got it in the neck. Then he told them he wanted babies to be sacrificed to him by everyone who had one. They were to go through the fire, he said. Now at this point they put their foot down and wouldn't do it. Well, he yelled and said that they had no faith and abused them through their mediums, especially Maxine Benton, who was foaming at the mouth and shouting curses and pounding the table. Then finally he caused the boiler to explode and almost start a fire at the side door of the house where it was located. It had to be replaced at great expense. That incident really frightened them all. Now Benton started to realize that Melkarth was the devil using an alias, so he shut down the weekly séances. But it was too late. Melkarth was in the house and insisted the place was his. He started playing tricks on the family at night, like turning the taps on in the bath till it overflowed. Or throwing plates from the kitchen cabinets and smashing them on the floor. Benton's wife, Maxine, begged him to move them away. He tried to, but he couldn't sell the house for some reason. In the meantime, the old guard Presbyterians in his congregation had succeeded in expelling the Spiritists. But they blamed Benton for the whole debacle, since he had been so gung-ho for conjuring up the dead. He had to resign as pastor. Then he got a call from a Presbyterian church in the interior to be their pastor. He had applied for the job, and so they thought it best to move there. Since he couldn't sell the house and didn't dare to live in it himself, he decided to rent it out. When he moved away, he rented it to Steve McVeigh and his sister. They lived there. McVeigh had done time for sex offences, and now he was a suspect in a murder case. You found out all about that. A young woman from the West Indies was out jogging on a mountain road. Whoever it was had stopped and abducted her. The body was never found. While the case was all in the headlines, McVeigh told Benton he was going to have to move away, so he'd have to find another tenant. I gathered that he told Benton more or less what he had done, though he didn't tell him how or where he had disposed of the body. He said to Benton that the house had made him do it. That was all he would say. Anyway, he moved away, and you met him once when he came back looking for something. What? I exclaimed. Was he suggesting that Melkarth made a murderer out of McVeigh? That McVeigh was just the agent of Melkarth, doing whatever he told him in dreams, in visions or whatever? If he contacted me through a dream, maybe he contacted Steve too, so that he became Steve Melkarth. I gathered that that was what Benton was afraid had happened, said Bob, and he had it on his conscience. Another thing on his conscience. In the meantime, you had moved in as a tenant, with me acting as agent. But when he heard from Steve why he was leaving, he decided to come back and keep an eye on the house himself. He knew it was Melkarth. Well, I know the two of you didn't get along. Then there was that chimney fire that happened. He must have guessed that Melkarth was behind it, but he didn't mention that either to me or to you. He just tried to pin the blame on you. Afterwards, of course, those OPP detectives came around and talked to you. Benton never let on he knew anything, like that Steve had been put up to this murder by Melkarth. It was a terrible thing to do, a terrible sin of omission, if you like. But as he was dying, with the fear of hellfire on him, he knew how much he had been in the wrong. How he was supposed to be leading people to God, but instead had served the devil. For that was who he took Melkarth to be in the end. Steve McVeigh is still in jail, isn't he? They say he'll never get out, as long as he doesn't tell them where the body is. I've always thought that they could never find the body of Marguerite Thompson, because he burdened it with petrol from a jerry can. Could be, said Bob. I have no idea. Well, it fits, doesn't it, Bob? Think of the chimney fire and the roar of exultation that I heard just afterwards, and think of how the house burned down when I wasn't there, and they never could tell how or why it happened. You mean then that that house was the fire pit of evil? In a word, Gehenna, I said. That was the house of Melkarth. Bob O'Connor sighed, and then shook his head sadly. Anyway, I don't know what happened afterwards, I said. I mean after it burned down. Well, Benton was going to spend money on rebuilding the place, but he had an injury while working on it, and lost an eye. Then he hired a contractor firm to do the renovation, but after a while they went bankrupt, and he couldn't get them to finish the job. So Melkarth won. Well, after the lot had stood empty for 6 months, he sold it to speculators who were interested in it for an apartment block. So it was an apartment block that was built on the site when he finally sold it. As far as I know, it's still there. No trace of the old house was left. Funny, I said. I had a dream myself years later that I was back there, and now there was a church with a cross on it built on the site. I had other dreams too, that the house was still there, and I had returned from a long journey to take possession of it again, but couldn't. Anyway, said Bob, I told you about Melkarth. Who is this Melkarth? You seemed to say, aha, when I mentioned him by name. Melkarth is the evil god of an evil city, Carthage. He's the biblical Moloch. Moloch, a false god if I remember rightly, but the Hebrews worshipped him for a time. Yes, he made children come to him through the fire in the valley of Gehenna. My God, how could a clergyman get involved with this stuff? Well, Melkarth or Moloch has his place in the Bible. A savage, brooding presence that just wants to take over if God's chosen people give him a chance. And anything in the Bible, a clergyman is going to know about it. If the name or the topic pops up, he'll say, aha. And if he gets interested, maybe he'll experience it and think it's okay. Or fair game. I don't know. But you see, it's not all that far from puritanical Christianity. In ancient times, the god of your tribe or nation commanded you to do terrible things. And if you wanted to be free of your sins, or wanted to be sure it rained for your crops, you did them things, and probably felt justified afterwards. In puritanical Christianity, which all these people were brought up in, it's much the same atmosphere. God demands things of you, and you cannot withhold them, even if it is something as terrible as sacrificing your only son on the top of a mountain. You're a sinner, and as such you can expect to be punished. So you take your punishment. That's the mindset. The one thing I can't forget, Bob, is all that it did to me. I mean, like the drinking. I started then, and I was doing it until recently. Can you imagine? I chalked that one up to Melkarth. Well, yes, said Bob. Maybe Melkarth is within us all. The funny thing is that we were all blind to him. To Melkarth? Well, I didn't know about that at the time. I remember you telling me at one point that David should have the house demolished. That's when I told you about the sense of evil, and about Steve McVeigh too, and what he had done. You were right, of course, but we were all too blind to the danger. I could only think of staying in that house, the house I'd got. Why was I doing that to myself? Of course, Jack Chrysler, who you didn't know, was encouraging me to take that stance. He didn't see what we were up against. Neither did you. And I never tumbled to the connection between Bent and his previous occupant and the whole thing about the house. Maybe we were all blind to the danger. I'm sorry I, for one, wasn't more perceptive. Well, I ended up being the victim. Victim? Haven't you ever done anything wrong in your life? Bob asked. Of course I have. Then don't think of yourself as an innocent victim, that's all. Life is always more complex than that. Meaning that I had something to do with Melkarth too. Well, he manipulated you too, didn't he? With that dream you told me, where he actually announced himself by name, and then the chimney fire. You played right into his hands. Maybe we were all a part of the system. Maybe we were all a part of Melkarth. He brought us together in and around that house and played us like a bunch of puppets, making us dance to his tune. Well, don't be too hard on yourself. You came out of it, didn't you? You've even stopped drinking, haven't you? Give yourself some credit. All right, I said, but I just hate being played for a sucker. Well, we learn from experience, don't we? Bitter experience. Nothing like that has happened since, has it? No, it hasn't. But it threw a dark shadow over me life, which I've never forgotten. To that extent, I've been shaped by me brush with Melkarth. How much of that do you believe in? Is Melkarth real? I'm prepared to accept that the devil is real, since the church teaches about him, and he's often mentioned in Scripture, though I've never had any direct experience of him. I don't know, I told him, shaking me head. Let's just say that there's a very negative aspect to man, as well as a positive one. We usually manage to keep the negative aspect in check. But sometimes we don't. And if there's a whole group that has appalling negativity over it, expecting nothing but punishment and stern tests from on high, Well, it allows that huge negativity that's bigger than the mind or personality of any one of us to get loose and even take over. And if it's got a chance, a tangible place it can occupy, all to the better. Or in this case, all to the worse. So you think we can conjure up evil powers, and they're waiting for us to try? I suppose, I said. Or let me put it this way. We can conjure up the evil within ourselves and let it loose. It's easier if there's a whole group doing it. The energy is greater than the sum of the parts, and it runs away with them. Then the problem is getting rid of it. Well, let's hope the house of Melkarth, or whatever it was, perished in that fire, said Bob. I pray that whatever people live in the new apartment block never have to encounter it. I shuddered. So do I said. You have been listening to The House of Melkarth by Turlough Conmee from 13 Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.